Hi there, and for my first real vlog post on how I'm doing things, I kind of wanted to do a baseline on how I sew leather together. It's not something that a lot of people end up doing, just in, regular life. So I was going to go over some of the things and then how I do it, just on a scrap piece of leather. First off, the way a sewing machine works isn't the strongest way to do stuff, and because leather has such a tendency to be used as a strong material for building things, you generally want a stronger seam. So what a proper hand-stitched leather actually has two crossing strands each way. I'll be showing that way. Lock stitch, which is what a sewing machine does, or what a sewing awl does. If you slip one of the threads on it, it ends up weakening the entire thing for quite a long, whereas if you happen to cut one of the threads in a double strand, fully sewn piece of anything, it doesn't have to be leather, it's quite a bit stronger. So first off, got my chunk of leather. I've got a couple different threads. I'll be using the big heavy one so you can see it, but I just wanted to mention that you do need different needles for different thicknesses of thread. Also, you should be using a thickness of thread that goes along with what thickness of leather or material you're sewing. You could also technically do this with like hard canvas. Some of my needles are technically like sailboat needles, but I'm using a kind of thick. It's probably about 7 or 8 ounces. Just a piece of scrap I had. And I'll be using this so that it, shows up nicely. I also have just a regular awl, which just allows me to poke holes through it, and that's going to help me so that I don't have my needles trying to do all the forcing, because they're really not strong enough. And then I just have this block to help me actually hold the leather once I have it, how I'm going to sew it together, and then I can really work on it while not having to hold it. And you want you don't want to use a regular like metal vise or something, because it leaves really bad marks on the leather. So that's why I use the wooden one, and you don't want to clamp it down all the way, otherwise you'll have a weird vise marking. And they make better ones than this. This is just what I happen to have. There's also a couple other things you can use, like there's lacing. If you want to use lacing for your thread, which is leather, which brings us kind of to our needles of choice. There's a couple different types of needles. This one you actually screw your thread or your lacing into the back end of it, and I will be using one of these, actually a slightly smaller diameter one, but if you look really carefully you can see that there's a hole there and there's actually threads inside of it. It won't work on a really small thread, and it doesn't necessarily work on all cloth threads, but it will work on pretty much any lacing that you have. I can find it. The other one I'm going to use looks like this, and you can see how it splits. It's actually a bent piece, and then it has 2 prongs bent up, and that holds onto the thread. There are, some other needles I have here. Here's some really thick ones. These would be like for sailcloth. You can also use them for leather. But my suggestion on these would be don't use them with a thicker thread. So if I was to use this and force it through something, you can see how it would bunch up right there, and I have to pull all of this material through the hole as well. That's a lot more stretch on the hole, and considering leather doesn't self-heal like fabric does, you're going to have a big hole there, and B, after a couple times pulling through, it's going to put a lot of strain right here on the corners of the lacing, so or the thread potentially. So that is going to possibly lead to breakage in your thread while you're sewing. Anyways, so I generally use these smaller needles for like if I'm doing small thread, or like 2 or 3 or maybe up to 5 ounce leathers. But for this, I'm going to use a couple different ones just to show you how to use them. And as far as finding out how much thread, My general thing is I'll figure out how big the pieces I'm going to sew, and I'm just going to stitch up, line up that, and I'll do 1, 2, and that's for like the left hand side, 3, 4, it's the right hand side, and then I do an extra just so I have some room to mess with. So I end up doing 5 of the lengths of the leather, or the stitch that I'm making. And now I'm trying to find my... Oh. So after cutting the length of thread that you need, my suggestion is to just melt the edge a bit, especially if you're using a nylon thread. Doesn't work on leather, doesn't work on a cotton thread. Might work on a cotton wax thread, but most likely that's just going to turn into a candle, which doesn't really help you. But it keeps your nylon threads from fraying, and also make sure that it's nice and strong at the end. So when you end up putting a needle on, it has something it can pull against without fraying. So for this needle, what you do is you spread that, and then you just lay it on the prongs, and then push it through the prongs. If you really need to, get some jeweler's pliers and just kind of press that just to make sure, because you'll be able to press a lot harder with that, but you don't want to go reefing on it because you'll end up just breaking the needle. Anyways, now for threading the lock safe, I think they're called lock safe, what you end up doing is you just poke an end in so that it gets grabbed by the threads that are in there, and then you simply, screw it on like it's any other screw, because basically what you're doing is you're screwing the thread into the back of the needle, and now that's in there all nice and tight. I now have my needles on here, and I have my leather, so I'm just going to put the leather in the vise. Yeah. Okay. So as far as this vise goes, you just tighten the outside ones, these finger tight, and then the one that really pinches it, you can see how this one is a little bit lower down. It actually pushes the bottom away, so this isn't coming out anymore. Now for some safety stuff. You can see on my fingers how I have some things. This one I wear just because I end up hitting my index finger a little bit, and because I actually like wearing it. But what these do is they allow me to pull on the thread like this. You can see how it's going right across that leather on my finger, on my pinky. Going right across the leather on my pinky. And what that allows it is so that I don't end up pulling the skin off my hand as I'm doing a bunch of pulls on it, because I have to do that every stitch. The other thing that can be really kind of useful, especially if you're not using an awl to pre-punch your holes, or some way of pre-punching your holes, is to use a palm press. And what this allows you to do is you can really push on the needle like this with a nice strong base that's in the palm of your hand, and not like this, because these needles are really big, they're kind of sharp, and half the time they'll end up going through your thumb rather than the tanned leather. Just one more tool. There we go. So I just need one more tool, and this just allows me to see and make sure that my stitches are all the same length. All I did was roll it down the edge, and you can see that it put little dots, because it just has a round thing there. Just gives me my spacing on my stitches. I don't always use that. The other thing I didn't use this on was these under pauldrons, because the stitches between each thread coming out and the bottom side was about half the distance, so I didn't have one that was equal to that. So I actually had to measure it out with a ruler and do dots on the back side and punch through that way. But you can kind of see where there's those little divots, and I can just come in here with my awl and push through. make sure you don't put your finger right on the other side of the hole, because you'll go straight through the leather, and considering leather is generally a tougher material than your nice squishy skin is still. I mean, it's just cow or pork or whatever skin, but it's still, you know, quite a bit more dried than ours are. So now I've got a bunch of holes, and they go, beep, loud banging. So now I got a bunch of holes, and they go all the way through. And what I do is you just take the thread, or your needle, and push it through one side, and then pull it. Measure the same distance, and then you go through the other one. Pull it through. And back through this way. And then this is where you really want to pull on it. And you can see already that I have a very strong stitch there, because right now all I've basically done is a loop around those two threads. So now all you have to do is, whether you want to do a whip stitch, which should go around this way and just continue up like that. You could do it as a cross stitch, which would be the same thing, and then fold this out. You can just do a joining stitch. And even though I pre-punched those holes, because these needles are so thick, in order to get such a thick thread through, I still end up pulling on it quite a bit, and it's not exactly easy work, especially because I have this huge halogen light right on top of me, which is nice because I can see what I'm doing, but it does make it a little bit warm. But that's the general gist of how to sew two pieces of leather together with a nice strong seam. And I mean, there's just 3 stitches, and there's no way that's coming apart, especially if I end it off with a knot or something. Now, as far as making this follow a costume, you want to go and look at your reference and find out exactly which way your stitches go, how big your stitches are across, all that good stuff. Right now all I'm doing is making a really disgusting knot so that I know it's not going anywhere. Spend a little bit more care with how you knot stuff if it's not, you know, on the outside or just a test or whatever. And then you just loosen this up, and boom, I've got just 3 stitches in there, but already the only way that I pull that apart is by literally ripping the leather. So the stitches are really strong this way. Anyways, that's my first little how I do stuff for costuming. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later.